Hello, I'm Christopher Snowden, the Head of Lifestyle Economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and I'm very pleased to say I'm joined here today by Dolly Theis, who is Programme Director for the Big Tent. And you'll see in a minute why I'm so keen to speak to Dolly today. It's because she's a rather interesting person. Because Dolly, you originally wanted to do this podcast on John Stuart Mill's birthday, didn't you?
Yes, ahead of it, in celebration of.
And we couldn't quite manage that, unfortunately. And you have John Stuart Mill as the wallpaper on your phone,
Yes.
which is quite a sacrifice because he wasn't the best looking bloke.
Oh, he's inspirational.
And you consider yourself broadly libertarian?
We will discuss
We'll
this.
get to that. Okay,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But despite
I'm a Millite or a million or whatever you call a Mill follower.
And you actually got On Liberty in front of
Yes.
you on the table. And yet, despite this love of John Stuart Mill, you are doing a Masters in Public Health.
PhD. Yeah.
A PhD,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
Presumably, that's going to lead to working in public health.
No,
No?
I'm leaving all options open.
But it may well do. You're interested enough to do a PhD,
Absolutely
you know?
fascinated.
And
yeah.
the obvious place to go would be to work in public health, in which case you will be violating everything that John Stuart Mill held dear and spending your whole time being paternalistic and harassing people, making people's lives miserable just because they want to eat, drink and smoke. Explain yourself.
Okay, so thank you for the introduction. And yes, as you say, I am a huge fan of John Stuart Mill and have been since I discovered him in my undergraduate, reading European philosophy. And it started with On Liberty, and then it sort of went into his other work, so Subjection of Women and Systems of Logic, which is actually very relevant to a lot of the kind of epidemiological research because it's all about inductive reasoning and epistemology and what you can sort of discover empirically. So he dealt with a lot of issues and obviously was the first MP in Parliament's history to advocate for women to have the right to vote, which was amazing. So he was an early kind of feminist in the political sense. And as you said, I have wanted to kind of chat to you about this because we obviously share, and you're quite vocal about your fandom of Mill. And I think, if I'm correct, you sort of, in terms of party politics, you would sort of identify closer to Mill than you would do to like a modern day political party or
Yes.
Mill's philosophy.
Yes,
as
I
such,
would
yeah.
like there to be a real liberal party for me to vote for, yeah.
Okay, so my understanding of, and this is generally kind of how people think of Mill, if they are familiar particularly with On Liberty, is the idea that the state should only intervene in personal freedom and personal liberty when there is a threat of harm to others, so the harm principle.
Yeah.
And but that is the kind of almost like top level for me when you read his stuff, you can come away with that, but I just can't help but question where those boundaries are. And he advocates, complete freedom of choice. He advocates a very meritocratic system. So he is against actually having. So he's pro having a tax on inheritance, for example, because it doesn't. He argues that it doesn't provide people with an even start in life. So he's got these very interesting kind of details around what having freedom actually means. And so my concept is based around a lot around sort of the modern behavior theories, so like Mickey et al.'s behavior change wheel, so the three components that allow someone to, or enable someone to make a choice and thus be free and choose for themselves and sort of and be enabled to kind of live in terms of individual responsibility, is capability and motivation and opportunity. And those sort of broadly provide someone with the ability to make a choice. And I got interested in this issue, in particularly that aspect of Mill's work, when I was writing a report for the Centre for Social Justice on childhood obesity. And I don't know how much people are familiar with, like whether it's helpful to say about the CSJ, but they were broadly based upon the principles of the 5 pathways to poverty, so that someone was more likely to end up in poverty if they experience the 5 pathways. So family breakdown, educational failure, worklessness, chronic worklessness in the household, serious personal debt and addiction of some sort. And so if you had experienced those particularly in your childhood, you were more likely to end up in entrenched poverty. And so it was about the sort of opportunities, motivations and capability that people have to make good choices, and sometimes that's really bloody difficult. So when I set about my report, I was kind of fascinated to understand how, because as a conservative, I am absolutely for equal opportunity rather than a concentration of equal outcomes. I think the state becomes tyrannical when it becomes focused on equal outcomes. But to really provide someone with an equal opportunity and thus the ability to make a choice, they have to be equipped and enabled and have the opportunity to exercise that choice. So I'm kind of curious where we meet, I guess, in that, because that's my sort of ontological view of the world, is that opportunity and choice and freedom comes only when one has the capability, motivation, and opportunity to
I would agree with you, and I kind of said this in my last book, Killjoys, that it is, I think, reasonable to say that somebody who is totally ignorant about what a product's going to do to them or what an activity is going to do to them, that they are not wholly making a free choice. And so I think, therefore, there is a role for education. Education may well come from the state. It seems to me, however, that most of the things that the public health movement is doing these days is about constraining choice. And you mentioned inheritance tax. Well, Mill was also very much against alcohol taxation. He said it was really
pro some alcohol taxation and restrictions in terms of opening hours and that sort of thing.
As am I. If there are, going back to the Mill's harm principle, if there are negative externalities, I think it's reasonable to have a tax on the product. But what he said in On Liberty was that if the tax is designed specifically to stop people drinking or to make them drink less, then that is really no different morally to prohibiting it entirely, and it's particularly going to prohibit poor people, so it's kind of snobbish and regressive as well. And taxation is just one of the ways in which the nanny state tries to constrain people's choices. It also tries to constrain information by restricting advertising. It restricts people's actions sometimes, in the case of the smoking ban. And I see very little actually in public health which is about liberating people to make better choices. When public health people talk about making the healthier choice easier, all they really mean is trying to eliminate what they see as the lesser choices. And if people continue to want to buy these products and do these things, which, let's face it, nearly everybody they're talking about does want to keep on doing these things, then the net result is that millions of people, in many cases, just have their lives made worse, usually only a little bit worse. The incremental, the limitations on freedom are usually fairly incremental. The taxes usually go up in fairly small measures, but the net effect is that people's lives are made more constrained.
Apart from transport, like one area that it feels, and this is sort of anecdotal in a sense, it's just what I feel like in terms of language and policies put forward. Transport seems to be the area in physical activity where it's much more focused on provision and active, rather than sort of banning sedentary behaviour, or sort of banning cars or whatever. It's actually, the focus has been much more on the provision of kind of cycle.
But that, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's because they can't find a way of taxing sedentary behaviour or banning sedentary behaviour.
That's
if
pretty
they could
cynical.
do, I think they probably would do. I also think it's the reason that you hear actually a lot less about physical activity from the likes of Public Health England than you do about sugar in biscuits and junk food advertising on the TV. They're one club golfers in a way, and they're copying a lot of the stuff that's been used with tobacco with varying degrees of success, and they just try and implement it onto totally different problems, like obesity, which is far more complex. And in my view, the main reason for the rise in obesity over the last 40 years is actually to do with physical activity rather than calories or sugar or anything like that. But there's nothing they can do about it. They can say, try and do 30 minutes a day, but they can't actually enforce it. They can't really blame an industry for it. They could, I suppose, at a push, blame the television industry or the sofa industry if they wanted to, but that would seem fairly obviously ridiculous. And so they go after people who are making food instead.
It's okay. I actually don't know the answer to this question already, and it might be interesting to people listening, but how did the lifestyle economics section start and when? Because I have a Mill reference point to it. So I'm curious about the history of it.
In the IEA, it started in 2013 because I think there are a few think tanks, Adam Smith Institute, for example, who talk about these things from time to time. They get asked to comment about the growing number of nanny state policies, and at that time you had David Cameron in charge, so there were various different things up in the air: minimum pricing for alcohol, plain packaging for tobacco. The obesity stuff was just kicking off with Jamie Oliver banging on about it, and it seemed to us at the IEA that there was a space for a think tank to have a small section of the organisation dedicated to looking at the stuff in a really systematic way, rather than just responding ad hoc to various different proposals, to look at it and say, right, is there an economic case for any of this stuff? Because sometimes there is. I've written about the externalities.
So it's definitely from just an economic perspective in terms of like what would be deemed the kind of positive outcomes of your work or the kind of proposals that you have, like economic prosperity or what
consumer well-being. Okay. This is the point of economics, and Mill understood this better than anybody because he wasn't just a philosopher, he was also a liberal economist. And but
he didn't advocate. This is what's so interesting, because he strongly doesn't advocate for a sort of high consumerist society, because when he talks about free market sort of capital, he thinks about it in a saving sense. So he's very, very clear about not sort of focusing too much on consumerism, but rather reinvesting the money. And particularly because I mean, you know his work, but he moved later on more towards a sort of socialist tendency, and there's quite a lot written about, was he a liberal, was he a socialist? Because when he talks about his wage fund as an example of the kind of dream scenario where you basically invest any profit and any capital back into the wages so that people are more socially mobile, which I kind of read and think, oh my God, he literally is talking about cooperatives, and that is his economic position. And that's where I find it, and it links actually on to why I ask about the history of the unit, is because his distinction between pleasures. And the unit obviously focuses very much on sort of smoking, alcohol, food, drink, etc. He is very clear again about the distinction between kind of higher and lower pleasures, and he sort of is quite snooty about what he regards as like physical sensations pleasures, and he's much more about the intellectual moral pleasures. And so when he talks about kind of the well-being and the improvement of mankind overall, and this links to his work on utilitarianism, because he doesn't necessarily talk about the focus being, he said the duty of an individual should not be to focus on their own pleasures, but the kind of happiness of the greater good. So I'm sort of curious, I read it like that, where it's not so much about like, let's make everyone able to smoke and drink, because he says that if there are long-term downsides to those practices, then he would advocate something where you think about the long term.
I think you have to make a distinction between what his personal view of the best way, in his opinion, for people to behave and live was, and how he thought the government should regulate that. I think that is the point. That he may well have disapproved of all sorts of things. I'm sure he did, but he defended people's rights to do them, and that's the point. He defended people's rights to do them because he understood that consumer well-being is in the eye of the beholder, and that it might seem completely crazy to some people that somebody wants to drink themselves to death or is quite happy going around being really fat and continues to shove cream cakes down their face. But he doesn't think that the government has a role of intervening, as much as he may disapprove. And that really is the essence of liberalism, because it's the essence of toleration.
Where he's not clear, and this is where I'm kind of fascinated again in practical policy terms, what he, when you start to get into the nitty-gritty of what he actually proposes should happen when someone drinks and actually affects others, and then the harm principle kicks in. He's very, very light on detail when it comes to actually what he proposes. And that's where I find I am not a libertarian in the kind of purest sense, because I default to more of a Burkean conservatism, where it's much more pragmatic and you have to understand the implications in which are feasible and realistic at that time. And all of that takes compromise. And actually Mill in Parliament, which I think is the most fascinating few years of his life, because he was a radical philosopher, and yet when he was actually in Parliament, a lot of what he did in practice was quite compromised. And there are obviously these hypocrisies that lie throughout his work, which is great, and I remember discussing them fervently, thinking, are these hypocrisies, and I actually thought, no, they're consistencies, because he was absolutely an advocate of always questioning, challenging, knowing that there are more than one truth, and it's only through discussion and debate together that you can kind of find those. And that's why, again, so excited to kind of be talking to you about this thing, because kind of between us, I'm kind of curious about where we agree, where we disagree. Defining health. So what role health plays in, I've tried to look up where Mill sort of thinks about this, but it's actually really difficult. And so stuff has been written about in the interpretations of how he would value health. And a lot of it is positive, that it would be regarded in the kind of higher pleasure category rather than the lower pleasure category. So what health, I guess, means to you on an individual level, and then what it means on a population level, what role it plays in terms of economic, because you've got obviously the DWP that have like a health department that focus very much on, and some of it plays into obesity, but sick days that are a result of health-related issues.
Well, health is one aspect of well-being. It's a very important aspect. But it's not the only thing. And one of the problems with public health lobby is it accepts implicitly, although it probably would never say it explicitly, that it is the most important thing, and anything that gets in its way needs to be squashed. So, health is important to me and to you and to most people, but so are lots of other things. So, in particular, is pleasure and enjoyment and socializing and nice food, and if you like smoking, a cigarette, and if you like drinking, a drink, and if you like getting drunk, getting drunk. So there are trade-offs to be made.
At what point does the government, so when those things start to impact or have a potential impact on society, so again, Mill discusses these a lot in relation to alcohol and drunken behaviour, but thinking about them in terms of the sort of more obvious of like when you have a heart attack because of an obesity related condition, or you develop type 2 diabetes from a poor diet and lack of physical activity, all of those sorts of things. Who is ultimately responsible when it comes to, and what role does the kind of state play in?
Yeah, well, this is the main argument that comes up across the board, from Public Health England down to just anyone commenting on a Daily Mail article. They'll say, I don't mind people smoking themselves to death or drinking themselves to death, but I don't want to pick up the pieces. I think there are two answers to that. First one is, insofar as it is an externality that, I get a heart attack and you have to pay for it, it's an induced externality. It's an externality that's been pushed upon you by the government deciding that we all have to pay for each other's medical treatment. Now, if we didn't have that system, we could have an insurance system, and the fact that I had very high cholesterol and smoked like a chimney would be factored in, and I'd pay the price, and you wouldn't do.
So based on the American model? Well,
based on any insurance model, potentially. Now, you would still have people who would be uninsured, and the state would step in to pay for them, and you hear exactly the same argument in places like America or Switzerland that have more of an insurance model, which tells me actually that it's not even a genuine argument. It's just an excuse for people who want to control other people's lives. But that's the first part of it. Is it's a different type of externality when the government is coercing you into this system, and it was never part of the 1946 Health Act or whatever it was called that created the NHS.
Well, they thought it would be out of business, and because everyone would be solved. And we'd all be healthy forevermore.
They thought healthcare costs were going to come down, and at the time the NHS was 0.5% of GDP, and now it's about 9% of GDP and rising fast. That's the other issue, is healthy lifestyles actually do not reduce costs, and that was the second point I was going to come to, that in most but not all cases the economic argument doesn't even exist to start with. It can exist if you just look purely at the health budget and don't look at anything else, but why would you do that as a taxpayer? So excuse me, you need to look at the government spending in the round, And that particularly includes welfare and pension costs. And that is the main reason, actually, that people living longer and healthier is causing costs to rise. There is not an obesity time bomb. There isn't a binge drinking time bomb in this country. What there is an aging time bomb, and it's a good problem to have because it's great that people are living longer and healthier lives. But it is a very expensive thing to have, and no one's got to grips with how we're going to deal with it. And rather than having a sensible conversation about how we pay for it, we just scapegoat fat people and smokers.
I'm gonna avoid the temptation of going, because I know we could end up in that conversation forevermore. But it's still it's still a cost to society. And I mean, I come from
No, it's not. That's what I'm saying. It's generally speaking a saving. The amount that somebody will cost society on net over the course of 75 years when they have a heart attack is lower than the cost of living to 95 in perfect health.
And I know all in terms of like the last 5 years of your life are the most expensive, etc., etc. It's very difficult, and however many health economic models have been trying to be made about this is endless. But again, this is a fascinating thing about its complexity, but it then comes back down to what kind of world you want to live in. And I use Amsterdam as an example, where everyone just assumes it kind of culturally has always been this cycling maniac place, and it's just the norm, and it's always been that way. And actually it wasn't. And in the 60s and 70s there were huge campaigns which were focused on sort of child road related deaths. And they just said, enough is enough. We cannot have this kind of system. And so it was about 10 years of really strong campaigning. And then suddenly they decided the authorities decided we're going to do something about it and completely redesign the city to be conducive to cycling and make it just safer for cycling and walking. And that's what happened. And we kind of take that for granted, that kind of decision, which in this case, it was a health related issue in the sense that it was about child deaths. And we talk about cycling a lot in relation to obesity and health in that sense. But it takes a massive decision by authorities. It doesn't just sort of happen. And so I'm curious about what you think in terms of government role to enable those sort of massive projects, which result in a cultural shift. The Dutch cycle, but we don't think of the Brits cycling achieving that in reality.
No, and I don't really hear Public Health England or any of the pressure groups calling for London to be redesigned at the cost of trillions of pounds to achieve the same kind of thing.
As loudly, because they do. Like, we have the kind of cycling walking strategy. It's in every document you can basically find. There will be an element of it.
But
there's about
none of them are going to put down a
and
plan and say we're going to rip up Westminster Abbey and put cycle lanes through it, because it wouldn't get any traction with politicians. The expensive stuff like that doesn't get traction with politicians. They want to make money, and that's why you end up with something like a sugar tax instead. It's major investments might make a difference with this kind of stuff, but it's not going to happen because the governments just want to tax things.
On sugar tax front, is your problem with the fact that it is a tax full stop? Or if it was a tax on individuals and it was about the kind of pricing side of things, would that be worse? This is sort of pushing reformulation.
That's been a bad side effect of it. And actually, it was the supposed intended effect was to get companies to reformulate their drinks. And I didn't think they'd do it because they all already had diet versions already. And unfortunately, a couple of the companies, Iron Brew and Lucasade, did decide they were going to ditch their long-standing original recipes, and thousands of consumers are really upset about it. And you might say, well, it's a small price to pay. You can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, and people can't live without their rye being a tough luck. But you've meaningfully reduced somebody's quality of life. The drink that they've been drinking all their lives is no longer available. And for what? Where is the omelette?
In terms of what? As in, like, you're talking about the direct link to health outcomes of some sort.
Well, do you really think there's going to be health outcomes from Ribena taking half the sugar out?
Well, so I mean, this is where again, it is so complex and fascinating. But like on tooth decay, you know, those are the sorts of statistics in the short term that I'm curious about, and there's a massive evaluation going on at the moment. So we'll kind of have to wait and see for that. And same with minimum unit pricing. I'm conscious that we have to get to keep all scrap. I have got two questions there. Okay, in terms of like policies that are realistic and now that you advocate for, who out there politically is someone that you would say is doing that, elected?
Well, none of them. I mean, there's a few fairly sound MPs, but they're not in a position to do a lot about it. I mean, Liz Truss is quite good. I guess she's got a fairly senior job.
Because what are her policies on health or things directly related to?
Well, she doesn't have policies as such. I mean, she didn't run for the leadership, and she's
Or
part of the
views,
government that
ideas.
has a lot of horrible policies, like the obesity strategy. I mean, her views seem to be pretty libertarian when it comes to lifestyle stuff. She doesn't want to have this reformulation program, for example. She doesn't believe in banning 2-for-1 pizzas, and I dare say there are quite a few other politicians, mainly on the backbenches, who feel the same way.
So she would be what? As in, then how does she then advocate sort of tackling issues related to health? I'm not always clear because I've seen a few things that she said which are like, the government should stop intervening on things, telling us what to do or what to eat.
Yeah.
But then I'm not always clear what the alternative is.
Well, why? She didn't have to give you an alternative. I mean, she's commenting on public policy. People often ask me when I'm on the radio, well, what are you going to do about child obesity? And I say, well, it's not for me to come up with child obesity policies.
Okay.
I don't personally think anything's really going to work. But, you know.
Okay, so we're going history. My phone turns around. No. Okay. Right. I'm going seriously old school.
Right.
The poor laws.
No, it's not nanny state. We've got to stick with the nanny state ones.
What would you find as nannies? These were all accused of nanny statism.
I thought you were
going to
come up with, seat belts and the smoking ban and.
But how these have all been accused of nanny statism in their time? I mean, they were like, all the cartoons are written about, even with cholera. Stop trying to find cases of cholera. I remember a Times article in the 19th century. Stop trying to find cases of cholera so you can justify your public health pay. That was literally a nanny state.
Actually, John Snow, and I'm glad you brought it up. John Snow and the whole cholera thing is a very interesting example of public health in action, even back in the 1850s. So you get all these epidemiologists and public health people now. They go down the pub on what was Broad Street, where John Snow famously pulled off the handle and stopped people drinking the water that was giving them all cholera. And this was seen as a great piece of epidemiology, first of all, because he'd worked out by looking at a map where the cases of cholera had come from, and he identified the source as being the Broad Street pump. This at a time when it wasn't understood that cholera was transmitted through water. And then he did something that public health people really like. He restricted people from doing something. He pulled off the handle unilaterally and solved the problem. And so public health people love this now, and they love John Snow now. What they tend to write out of history, and what the Lancet only apologised for a few years ago, because they were very unpleasant to John Snow throughout his life. What actually happened was that the public health establishment poo-pooed John Snow. They were intent on going after the polluting industries in London, which were creating a lot of stink, because they believed in miasma theory, which is quackery, but they believed that cholera was spread through the air. And so they were going after the factories, and they had a bill that they wanted pushed through that was going to stop businesses doing this and that. And I dare say quite a lot of it was perfectly sensible. But they became completely fanatical about it, and they accused John Snow of being a hired gun of the polluting industries, which, as a matter of fact, he was, because they paid him to give expert testimony. But in the end, he was proven right, largely after he died. He got a very snotty obituary in the Lancet after he died. But I think actually it's a prime example of public health doing what they've been doing ever since, which is going after capitalist enterprises with their own harebrained quack ideas, and then shooting anybody down as a stooge of industry if they dare to say anything back.
To conclude on pro sanitation laws or anything related to clean water sanitation, the original public health interventions.
Yeah, well, and that was all great stuff. That was all the sanitation and the vaccinations and ridding the country of contagious diseases is all great stuff. But the point is,
food, health and safety
all
standards,
good. Yeah, road safety,
living standards.
all of that is great. But it's all fundamentally different, as I'm sure John Stuart Mill would have appreciated. Fundamentally different to coming up to me, for example, and saying, you're eating too many biscuits, so we're going to reformulate the biscuits with less sugar and it's for your own good. Or come up to me and saying, we don't want you smoking, we're going to put the price up to £10. That's totally different, because there isn't the need for collective action. There is a need for collective action when you've got the municipal water supply full of cholera. There's a need for collective action when you've got horrendous unhygienic cities and terrible sanitation, or if you've got somebody who walks into the country with Ebola. There is a case for illiberal actions. I don't mind you if you want to quarantine that person for a few weeks against his will. That's okay.
To seatbelt laws and that sort of.
No, I mean the seatbelt law is always brought up as a precedent for doing other stuff. Now it's even brought up in terms of plain packaging. Somebody in Parliament said, people complain about seatbelts, but it's exactly the same thing with this. That was actually the best reason not to do it. Seatbelt law I'm not really opposed to. I think the infringement on liberty is very small and the protection of safety is pretty great. However, it is well worth going back to 1980 or whenever it was and look at the speeches the handful of people who opposed it said.
Lord Fowler himself.
Was
who
it?
Then introduced it.
Oh, was it him? Yeah. There were a few others, and at least one of them directly cited John Stuart Mill, and he explicitly said, where will it end? If we start using the law and threatening people with fines for doing things that are risky to them but pose no risk to anybody else, it's open season. And you know what? It has been open season. And people like Sarah Wollaston will constantly cite the seatbelts as a self-regarding action which had no million justification for a ban, and yet we did it anyway. And people have got used to it. And therefore, let's do lots more stuff in the same direction.
But you wouldn't repeal it?
I don't think it's a big enough issue to worry about too much. But I don't think there's any moral justification for that law.
Because this is what's interesting about a lot of the of what is a meaningful freedom. And I guess that's where I'm curious about the kind of higher, lower pleasure distinction that Mill makes, is what is a meaningful freedom. So when you spend, a vast majority of your time nitpicking on policies that are about portion size, I'm sure you're against, and all of these sorts of things. And where do you draw the line with what is truly meaningful? If someone can't get access to a massive portion, but they can still buy the product, is that not the distinction between a meaningless liberty and not where you could sort of go on almost infinitely to what is a meaningful liberty in this sense?
Well, as I said before,
I want to have a burger the size of the planet. Why don't I have the right to that?
Well, a lot of this is incremental, so it might seem trivial in small doses. The food reformulation thing is not remotely trivial. It's an incredible idea that the government is pushing through with very little
But that
oversight.
It's funny because I don't see that as nanny state in the true sense. A nanny for me is about being told you can and cannot have this, and it's very naggy, and that's the kind of sense of it. And information, traditional kind of paternalism of just the provision of information, then you go and make your own choice with the assumption that everyone makes choices. Again, I come back down to the kind of behaviour change theory about the assumption that people are rational and can make those choices at all times. And we know that's not necessarily the case, because that's why we have, law and order and all sorts of different things and nuances about these sorts of issues with relation to lots of different things. And knowing a bit of your previous work, this is where it gets sort of tricky. If you should learn, if you go and gamble your money away, you should kind of learn the lesson sort of thing. But should we stop giving people money? I think there's an argument you've made before, but something along those lines of you should have the liberty to go and do that, but you should essentially learn from your actions.
Yeah, and people generally do. And that was something, again, that Mill said in the book. He said, and it comes actually to your point about what you see as these kind of trivial freedoms, is if people don't have to make even small decisions anymore because the government is making them for them, then eventually they'll lose the ability to make any kind of decisions for themselves at all, or to think at all for themselves. And that is one of the big objections he had to what we would now call the nanny state, which is that it mollycoddles people to such a degree that they're no longer able to deal with trade-offs or with risk.
But it's putting such an emphasis on it's like saying if you don't have this massive Coca-Cola available, like your life is so degraded as a result of that.
No,
and
it's not
just
saying the opposite. He's
so
saying it's a very
more...
small thing. But if you have thousands and thousands of small petty restrictions, how hasn't the state got too big when it's starting to regulate these things? Do you not feel that maybe the government is too big when it's deciding exactly what recipes every item of food should be made with? That it's deciding how many cigarettes be in a cigarette pack, what the packaging should look like. Endless petty regulations restricting this, restricting that, all of which I agree are quite small in their own terms. And that's how they get through. Because if you people in public health, if you actually said what you wanted to do 20, 30 years hence, the public would be up in arms about it. You have to do it slowly. But that's really how...
sort of
that
Overton
is how,
window.
Well, yeah, kind of, yeah. But that's how... That's how freedom is generally taken away.
But what about when you go back in time and there were results? So the Boer War, for example, Salisbury, Prime Minister at the time, there was an issue about recruitment. So 50% were in a physically deteriorated. Yeah. Well, they really shit diet, basically. And he introduced the Committee on Physical Deterioration. And then that led to the first provision of kind of school meals properly, like a government-led scheme, and weighing and measuring, and all of those sorts of things that feel sort of very familiar now. But actually, when you look back, that was to tackle an issue related to having a strong enough army. And then you can flick forward a few years and you get to the Second World War, and you've got Lord Walton, who I just think is a ledge, but he was food minister, and introduced a lot of the rationing and which was obviously in extreme times, but a lot of the evidence shows that they're one of the kind of healthiest generations to come out were those that were raised in that time. So these aren't
a lot of sugar in the ration.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking like everything was very, very different. Proportions and portion size and all of that kind of stuff was.
But they were giving people things, weren't they? Both of your examples there. That's the government supplying people with things, giving them more options. Whereas public health, since the 1970s, had been about taking options away. It is fundamentally destructive rather than creative.
But they weren't facing the same issues in terms of so they were facing issues of a lack of. So they were filling that, whereas we don't have that issue, which means that the result is if it's too much, then you sort of have to take it away. Although I do
you
actually...
You don't have to take it away. You can advise people to eat less. You don't have to take it away. This is a very authoritarian view. Advise
people to consume less. Just providing the information and assuming that if someone has only access to certain options in their environment and there's a normalisation of culture.
All sorts of options in their environment. There aren't any food deserts in Britain. There might be a few in America if you haven't got a car. There are no food deserts in Britain. People have never had more choice. There are about 40,000 different items in the average supermarket, and most people live within a couple of miles of one. It's not a matter in terms of, but then how a restricted choice. It's a matter that people in public health don't like the choices that are being made. And actually, a lot of people are quite happy to overconsume both food and alcohol because they enjoy it, and they're not too bothered, actually, if they're putting their health at some slight risk through drinking more than the made-up 14 units a week. And actually, a lot of people are quite happy being fat when it comes down to it. This is not being done because there's some great cry from the general public saying, please help us, restrict our freedom, take this food away. I can't help myself.
I'm going to ask you to go, because through my CSJ report, I got to know the Lambeth Healthy Weight Project well, and they provided a lot of sort of case study stories for the report, and they are quite similar to the Amsterdam Healthy Weight Programme in terms of, and Henry and all these sorts of like very family focused and tying up services and a lot of kind of one-on-one support. And I just don't that is not the reality that they experience as a charity when they've got families coming through suffering from multiple issues typically, and typically poverty-related issues. And obesity happens to be one quite substantial issue that often the children have, and it's always related to at least one other problem, whether it's a mental health issue or abuse or childhood trauma or anything like that, where often the issue is that if you provide a service that's like, right, go and eat healthily and have more exercise, it doesn't actually tackle the underlying cause of why that child has ended up in often like clinically morbidly obese situations. So just to sort of say that people are happy being fat, that is not the experience.
I was talking about adults, not children, and you're doing the usual trick of throwing children in there and trying to muddy the waters.
But that's
Mill,
that was my experience.
Be happy with paternalism for children. I mean, paternalism almost by definition.
But then
is
you must be pro the
children.
childhood obesity plan then, because that's all focused on children.
It's not remotely focused on children. It applies to every food going. And after a year or two of this pretense that it's about children, Public Health England came out and said, actually, we've looked at the data here, and we found actually that children eat exactly the same kind of stuff as adults do. So we're going to reformulate everything. So the think of the children card is nearly always disingenuous in public health.
As a libertarian, what's your distinction then with the role of the family versus state? Because Mill was obviously, as you say, very clear about government having the ability or right to intervene when we were talking about children. But obviously children are raised in families, and so you can't just separate children as individual entities from a family and just say that the government can totally direct everything towards children and not consider the role of the family. So what in terms of your views, are the distinctions or nuances around that?
Well, I mean, I think that obviously the parents are ultimately responsible for raising their children. In the small minority of cases where parents abuse their children or neglect their children, clearly there's a role for the government to step in. And there are some areas where the government can kind of reinforce parental supervision by, for example, banning the sale of cigarettes to children, that kind of thing. It also, because it runs most of the schools, it has a role in providing food there and education and physical activity space and that kind of thing. But I don't buy the idea that a policy like plain packaging for children for tobacco is aimed at children. I don't buy the idea that reformulation or the sugar tax or any of this stuff is aimed at children, because quite clearly it's not aimed at them in any way. AIM makes it seem as if it is in some way targeted. In actual fact, it's not. So the children are very peripheral to most of these issues. It is the adult consumer who is by far the main actor involved, and they're the ones who will bear most of the brunt.
What if there has ever been a view that is something that the public health community or who you, because you talk about Public Health England a lot, I'm guessing they're kind of who you think of when you think of public health, that you agree with, things that they're doing that you agree with or would agree with?
I read something last week about some trial in New Zealand where they're getting kids to brush their teeth in the morning, and that seemed to have a big effect on tooth decay, and didn't seem to me to be illiberal.
How was that? That was done, what, through schools, communities?
Through schools, yeah.
Through schools?
Yeah. And it seemed to have a pretty impressive effect. And clearly there are parents who are not getting their kids to brush their teeth in the morning. So that seems to me quite a good idea. But it'll never catch on in Britain because it'll cost money to do. And it'll mean that the likes of Public Health England are no longer able to blame sugary drink makers for tooth decay. Tooth decay rates have gone down massively, by the way, over recent decades. The answer to tooth decay is simply brushing your teeth. As long as you're not eating sugar very, very frequently throughout the day, you will have no problem so long as you brush your teeth twice a day. And all the kids who you read about who are having a lot of dental extractions, I will bet you £1 to a pork scratching they're not brushing their teeth. And something like this schools program potentially could work. But I had to strain to even think of that example. I don't I don't agree with them about very much, because they're going in completely the wrong direction.
So is there any part of wanting to create a healthier society that you agree with? other than, I'm guessing, the transport stuff, you sounded pro active, provision of...
travel's a nice idea, but most people in 100 years are still going to be living in the same streets that they live in now. So the idea that we can just replan our cities is just one of these.
But you think it's easy right now for everyone, regardless of background, etc., to live a healthy life?
Broadly speaking, yeah. I think the options for healthy eating especially have never been better. I think it's difficult with the climate that we have in this country to do a lot of exercise necessarily. And exercise has been kind of written out of a lot of people's jobs, which is, I think, one of the main reasons people are getting fatter in a lot of parts of the country, in fact the whole country. We are having a healthier society despite public health people, really, not because of them. I mean, I'll give you two examples. One, alcohol consumption's gone down massively in the last 15 years. It's had nothing to do with government policy. There hasn't really been any government policy on alcohol, and yet people are drinking less, and millennials in particular are drinking a lot less. There seems to be very little interest from people in public health about why that should be, because they had nothing to do with it. Second example, what I would call food fads, but again, millennials seem to be leading the way on this. There are people who are now obsessed with healthy eating, or whatever they believe to be healthy eating.
Raw food diets,
exactly,
you name it.
all this kind of stuff, paleo and what have you. This has been completely organic. It hasn't had any public health involvement. In fact, all we've heard from public health is a load of drivel about sugar. And so there is just a tendency amongst large sections of the population to lead healthier lives these days, and no one really knows what it is. But the smoking rate is the only thing really that public health people can point to and say we had something to do with that, and they did up to a point. But actually, if you look in other countries that don't have anywhere near as much draconian regulation of tobacco as we do, they're doing as well, if not better. America, for example, has a lower smoking rate than we do, and they've still got tobacco advertising, cheap cigarettes, loads of places you can smoke, and so on. So that's one example where, again, things were just going in that direction because people learnt about the hazards of smoking, and public health people have tried to take credit for that, usually for no good reason, and are now applying exactly the same weapons to gamblers and drinkers and people who eat food, and it will do nothing but damage.
But you would be pro active provision of alternatives. So if there was anything introduced about, like, I don't know, reducing tax on healthy products or making it easier,
cheaper,
cheaper,
any
whatever.
Tax on healthy products. Yeah, fruit and veg are incredibly cheap. And I actually did a report about this a few years ago called Cheap as Chips, and just looked at the price of these things, and all your stereotypical junk food, especially fast food in restaurants, is incredibly expensive compared to having a vegan diet and eating lots of starchy carbohydrates, as the government recommends. It's not an excuse. People are not neglecting turnips and carrots because they're too expensive, and you have to be completely out of touch with reality to believe otherwise.
But it's the convenience, even as I talked about the fact that their whole kind of business model is built on cost saving, and in 2016 I think marked the first year of it being about convenience, and a lot of people are eating more conveniently and eating out of the home, and it's very difficult, as you know, to measure diets or to capture what people are eating, and people often underreport, and you've acknowledged many times in this conversation that people are becoming more obese, or populations are becoming more obese. So I guess I'm just curious, when pushed, because anyone who knows your work knows your views on most things, and that's why I'm sort of not opening up those conversations, but more trying to understand how, I guess, you would sort of see as policies that would be enabling a healthier society, it to be easier and more normal for everyone to live healthier lives in a way that is conducive to your kind of your libertarian views, I guess.
I think calorie labelling is one area. I know the government is looking at calorie labelling in
out of home.
Yeah, in the out-of-home sector and on alcohol, and I'm kind of in favour on alcohol.
But do you say that publicly?
Yeah,
I mean,
I have done. Yeah, I have done recently. Actually, people assume I'm going to be against it, and I'm not. In fact, I'm in the Sun today saying there's a case for calorie labelling on alcohol. There are unintended consequences people need to think about. Actually, there are issues with people who have eating disorders being surrounded by calorie counts all the time, and with alcohol. It seems very likely that people who are concerned about their weight, and we're talking particularly about young women here in practice, are going to look at the calorie labels on alcohol and go for the drink that has the fewest calories, which will probably be something like double vodka with slimline tonic as opposed to a glass of wine or a pint of beer. And there are possibly issues there as far as public health people should be concerned. Personally, I'm less concerned because I think having the information is the main thing. And if people want to stay slim by just drinking whiskey, that's entirely up to them. But I'm not against people giving more information. I do genuinely believe actually that people don't know how many calories there are in alcoholic drinks and also in some foods. On the other hand, I do think people have a pretty good idea that there are a lot of calories in a cream cake and a pizza and then not so many calories in a slice of...
So what about portion size? Because in a way you're not taking away options, but portion size is just showing people, which we inevitably, when I have a plate of food, and it's just given to me, I tend to just not think about it and eat it all, and everyone can sort of associate with that to some extent, that portion size. And when you look at like even plate sizes, glasses sizes changes since the 1950s and stuff, this has all been looked at. What is your view on portion size?
Portion size regulation by the state, you mean? Well, I'm totally against it. Again, it comes back to this thing of how big do you want the state to be? You're going to go around every pub and bar and cafe and restaurant in the country and tell them how big the portion sizes can be, and then send inspectors around presumably every now and again to make sure they're not breaching. But you mean
there shouldn't be any end, so people should be able to buy things in any portion,
yes,
and
people should
consume them.
Dolly, like John Stuart Mill said, people should be allowed to do what
he
they want.
He just so did not. I mean, this is what I find fascinating or funny, that we're conflating a lot of what we're talking about in relation to obesity to Mill, because he was so not interested in those kind of pleasures. And he was,
you think Mill would have been in favour of having the government regulate food portion sizes in cafes, do you?
No, I'm not saying that. I just don't think he concerned himself. When he was thinking about kind of liberties, he does distinguish between the more meaningful liberties to him.
We've been through this. That's just his opinion. It's kind of like people bring this up about Margaret Thatcher. You know, they say, oh, she unleashed all this kind of greed and all this kind of stuff. But that wasn't her. She was actually a much more kind of restrained and small c conservative person. But there's a difference between your own personal view of how you should live your own life and what you think the government should be doing to other people. And John Stuart Mill could have been the most puritanical person going in his own life, as far as I'm concerned. I know he wasn't particularly, but he, more puritanical probably than I am. But that's not the point. He wanted people to be able to live whatever life they chose for themselves, as he said in the book, not because it is necessarily the best life, but because it is their life. And that is the point.
But it's just when I look back in history, again coming back down to you sort of saying that we've got to keep on nanny state things, and I was surprised because of not including vaccinations and clean water and sanitation, all of those things into it. The arguments have been made previously against these introductions in exactly the same way. And in fact, there's one speech by Disraeli in sort of 1878 or something like that, in Manchester, where he has his famous line, sort of health line, which is the Sanitas Sanitatum Omnia Sanitas, health above everything. And he uses that against the anti kind of nanny state rhetoric of certain members of his own party, saying, what role does government have in telling us whether we can, telling us, coming onto our houses and our workplaces and saying they have to be scrubbed and cleaned and blah, 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 blah. And it's exactly the same argument principle. You can look back and say it's very different about the sorts of choices and saying, who would want dirty water as an option, for example. It's the same. They're the same argument, same principle.
It's a totally fallacious argument that you're making. You're saying that just because somebody used a similar bit of rhetoric about something 150 years ago that we now think is fine, then therefore I'm wrong because I'm using a similar thing. I could turn it around and say, the Nazis invented the concept of passive smoking, banned smoking everywhere, and had big anti-tobacco campaigns. Therefore, everyone who's in favour of those kind of policies are Nazis. It's fatuous argument to make. You make an argument based on the specifics of the argument, and the big difference between the argument you're talking about then and the kind of stuff that public health are doing now is, again, it comes down to this question of, are these other regarding actions or are these self-regarding actions? In the 19th century, there may well have been greedy industrialists who didn't want to clean up the water supply, but given that this posed a risk to the entire community and the community couldn't do anything about this without legislation, it's fundamentally different to telling me that I'm not allowed to drink a certain amount or see an advert for a pork pie before 9 p.m. These are totally different issues, and the difference is the John Stuart Mill's harm principle, that some things affect other people and some things don't. And put aside the bogus arguments about cost to the NHS, there really aren't very many negative externalities. And when there are negative externalities, as with alcohol, and I would accept that you've got cost to the police service and that kind of thing, then you can deal with it in a normal economic way of putting a tax on the thing.
We're gonna, I feel like, start going round in circles.
This could run and run, so I think this is a good place to end this discussion. Dolly, it's been a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you.
Do you want to tell us about the Big Tent quickly?
Yes. So this is in sort of ahead of the Big Tent Ideas Festival, which is taking place August 31st in Mudchute, London, looking up at the Canary Wharf from a community farm, and we have a much bigger capacity this year, so it should be fascinating. And it is all about people that differ coming together and debating and discussing and challenging their own ideas, and the more of that, the better.